Hi, and welcome to Person-Centered Theory. Three of the core conditions for person-centered theory are unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, and congruence. And we'll talk about these three conditions as we go throughout this lecture. You see a picture of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is known as the developer of person-centered theory. He is also known as the father of psychotherapy research. He was really one of the first to closely examine the therapeutic relationship and the counseling process. He was also one of the first clinicians to conduct empirical quantitative research on counseling. He also de-emphasized pathologizing clients and diagnosing clients and really began to emphasize strengths and resources that are within the client, and that was a really different way of looking at things when he was first coming on the scene. So, major concepts of person-centered theory. Person-centered theory is a humanistic approach, and humanistic approaches sort of have an underlying belief that humans and people have the potential to find meaning in their lives and that they have the ability to become self-actualized. As I talked about before, congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding are not just something that is suggested in this theory, they're considered vital and essential through the therapeutic relationship, and that if those things are not there, that it won't be effective. This treatment won't be effective. The therapeutic relationship is, through the therapeutic relationship, we can have client awareness and growth. Trust in the client is paramount. A belief that the client has the ability to become self-actualized and then to change their attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and their lives. There's a nice quote here by Carl Rogers. "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." I think this one really sums it up. I think both for the counselor and for the client, so that we can accept the client as they are, accepting them as they come to us today, and every week is a new week, and accepting them where they are without judgment. That's where that unconditional positive regard comes in. From a person-centered viewpoint, view of human nature is very positive. I really like this. I liked picking out images for this entire lecture because it is so positive. It is so accepting. The view of human nature is that people are naturally trustworthy, capable of self-actualization, and able to make positive changes within their lives. People are naturally able to help themselves and naturally, through the therapeutic process, to live more effective and productive lives. People can learn to make positive choices in their lives. And again, this belief goes throughout. It's a view of human nature. It's a view of how people come to us, and it's a view of how people can change. Yay. From a person-centered theory perspective, origin of problems, when a client's problems come about when a client's real self is incongruent with the client's ideal self. And this can be when we as people have images and ideas of how we want to be and how we hope our lives are. And maybe every morning we start out thinking this is how it's going to be. But then these little decisions and our environment and things that happen come in conflict with how we want to be versus how we actually are every day during the day. And so from a person-centered theory way of thinking, that's where problems come from. Feelings of helplessness, powerlessness, and lack of direction. This is a big one, I think, when we feel like we don't have power, we don't have choices, we don't have any control or any say over our lives. That's another place that problems arise. I love this quote. "People are just as wonderful as sunsets if you let them be. When I look at a sunset, I don't find myself saying, 'Soften the orange a bit on the right-hand corner.' I don't try to control a sunset. I watch with awe as it unfolds." And this quote is also by Carl Rogers. It really speaks to me as a counselor, as a client, and as a parent. Maybe in particular as a parent, I think about all the ways that I try to shape and mold and improve my kids. And reading this really helps me to try to have unconditional positive regard for them as well as for my clients. This slide is about ways of thinking as a person-centered counselor. The focus is on the person, not the problem. The focus of the therapy is on the person and all that they are, and not just their problem. It has a very positive view of people, and I can't help but like that and be attracted to that in my own counseling. Also, little, if any, focus on diagnosis. And again, this was really new when Carl Rogers was coming up with this. People were still kind of in psychodynamic thinking patterns of diagnosis and labeling. And person-centered theory really made a big shift away from that. There's a quote by Anne Frank: "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Some ways of being a person-centered counselor include the belief that humans have a natural tendency towards self-actualization, and that humans possess natural movement towards wholeness and growth. Given the proper environment, like an acorn growing into an oak tree, that humans have the potential to reach self-actualization and wholeness. The core conditions, genuineness, as we mentioned previously, unconditional positive regard for the client. That doesn't mean approval of all behaviors, but accepting the client for who they are. And empathy is both felt by the counselor, experienced by the counselor, and then communicated to the client and explicit in the session with the client. This slide includes a few more ways of being from a person-centered approach. The counselor holds a deep desire to be real with the client, being congruent and authentic with the client. And being real with the client doesn't mean saying everything you think every time you think it, but it means sharing yourself and your feelings in real and therapeutic and caring ways. To empathize with the client, and again, to feel what the client is feeling and to be able to express it in an effective way, in an honest, open way. And to value and trust the client. And that kind of goes along with the belief in human nature, valuing and trusting that the client does have the capability to become self-actualized. And I love this quote because I think at this point, sometimes it gets confusing for new counselors to be told certain things about being with a client, and then we say, but be real, be yourself. And it gets really, or it can get really discombobulated in your head. You're in your head trying to include theory, trying to say certain things and not say certain things, and then you're told to be right there with the client. And I had a student one time tell me that they had all these things in their head, and then they kept thinking to themselves, and I'm supposed to appear warm, and she kept telling herself that, and of course it had the opposite effect. But so this quote is, "Trust yourself, you know more than you think you do." And that's about bringing your own wisdom and your own experiences into this therapeutic relationship as you do learn to trust your empathic responses and feelings. So here we have a few ways of doing counseling. This technique doesn't rely heavily on, this approach doesn't rely heavily on technique. So there aren't a lot of things that you do in a counseling session, scripted things that you do. It's more about being. But some things that you do are the counselor listens, reflects, and returns responsibility to the client as a way of being with the client. The counselor helps clients recognize previously unseen parts of themselves by reflecting, by being with, by showing empathy. The counselor is non-directive, but that doesn't mean that they're not active. Counseling in person-centered approach is very active, and the counseling relationship is part of the healing and the growth that comes from this approach. So the counselor is very engaged and really tries to maintain that connection with the client and being with the client at all times. So now we're going to talk a little bit further in depth about those core conditions. We'll start with congruence. Congruence basically means that the counselor is real with the client. The counselor is, as I said earlier, you don't share everything, but the counselor is intentional with what they share, carefully sharing themselves in a therapeutic manner. The counselor expresses their genuine feelings and reactions within the therapeutic relationship with the client. And the counselor models how a congruent and self-actualizing person behaves. Originally, I had put self-actualized person, and Michael pointed out that none of us are really ever fully self-actualized. We're all self-actualizing all the time. The next core condition that we'll discuss is unconditional positive regard. This means that the counselor genuinely cares about the client and about the client's well-being. The client learns to trust by learning to trust the relationship. And that trust, when a counselor is not genuine with a client, the client will pick up on this and not trust the relationship as much. So that's where it's really important to be genuine and real. Acceptance, I think this is a really important one. Acceptance of the person does not mean approval of all behavior. Because I always think about a client who might have done something, I don't know, really creepy or that I consider a really unethical behavior. And I think some people get caught up in this theory thinking that because they give unconditional positive regard, that they have to say, "Oh, good for you," or "I like that about you," and that's not what it's saying at all. We don't have to, as counselors, we don't necessarily have to approve of everything that our clients do, but it does mean acceptance of the person, and I think for me that means having a greater understanding of where that person might have been and their experiences and their environment, and but still, that underlying belief that people can self-actualize and that people can grow and change and stop doing those creepy behaviors. The final core condition that we'll talk about is accurate empathic understanding. The focus here is on immediacy. In the moment, in the here and now, you'll hear those kinds of things a lot. But what that means is in the session, what you as a counselor are experiencing with the client. The counselor feels what the client is feeling. That's empathy. And we'll talk a lot about that in theories class and beyond. And when we are able to express, as counselors, when we're able to express our empathic understanding, it helps the counselor, it helps us to become aware of things that the client may not be aware of. And then, of course, we can share that awareness with the client. And that's part of that therapeutic relationship. It's part of what reflection and empathy and congruence, it's part of what can grow from those core conditions. So the process of therapy, what do we do from the person-centered approach in the counseling room? One of the most important, and again, this was different back in the day. Now it seems a little bit more commonplace in other theories as well, but the client chooses the goals for therapy, not the counselor. The client, the counselor helps the client realize the facades or the masks that they wear and how these masks or facades keep them separate from others. It keeps them distance from other people and how it keeps them from being real in their relationships, including within the therapeutic relationship. Self-actualization and congruence for the client is something that we hope comes from this process. And again, the focus is on the person and not the problem. And that's one of the tenets of this theory that comes through within the process of therapy. A few roles that a counselor coming from this approach might take on are that the counselor does not rely heavily on technique. As I said before, there aren't a lot of scripted questions or techniques, strategies that you use. It's more about being with the client. The counselor is non-directive, client-centered. In fact, this approach used to be called non-directive approach, but I think Carl Rogers changed that because people thought that it meant it just went anywhere, kind of, and that the counselor was not really active. And so person-centered becomes a little bit more descriptive, that the focus is on the person, not the problem or not the techniques that the counselor might use. And but the counselor can still be very active in person-centered. The counselor does not implement or design a treatment plan, which again, back then, that was really different. There's little or no focus on diagnosis. And the counselor and the therapeutic relationship is actually an instrument of change. So I thought I would briefly go over each of the questions that I have on this slide. And then I would like for you to go through, you don't have to rewrite the question unless that's helpful, but just go through and write number 1, and then please write down your response. And my hope is that we can go over this and discuss it in a big group, or perhaps small groups, tomorrow in class. So I'll go over each question and just maybe say a little bit more about it in case you have little wonderings about what the question means. And but feel free to skip this part if it's not helpful. Question number 1, I am most congruent, authentic, genuine, or real with others when, and then you can fill in the blank for that one. If I were more genuine in my interactions with, and then I think that means a person's name, what would be different? Number 3, describe what your mask looks like, meaning describe your front or your facade that prevents you from being authentic, genuine, or real with others. Number 4 is self-awareness important to you? What does it mean to be self-aware? That one's a pretty in-depth one. That can be different. All of these can be different for everyone, but that one in particular has a lot of personal meaning, I think. Number 5, how well do I fully embrace the here and now, and what typically stops me from being in the here and now? And that's an important one to think about as a future counselor. Number 6, my view of what it means to have unconditional positive regard for another person is, and feel free to provide examples or whatever comes to mind for that one. Number 7, do I believe the therapeutic relationship is sufficient in itself for change to take place? That's a big question. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to more discussion tomorrow in class.